This is Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lafrac. You know, you don't need to be a clever detective to find a good murder mystery novel. Ever since Edgar Allan Poe popularized the genre in the mid-19th century, bookstores have kept their shelves crammed with tales of devious killings solved by intrepid detectives and sometimes even ordinary folks who take it upon themselves to find and reveal the perpetrator of the crime. What's harder to find, though, is a book with a murder mystery at its core that's not just a page-turner devoted to plot. One that also satisfies readers who love the nuances of language, complex protagonists, and a setting distinctive enough that landscape becomes a critical character amid the action taking place. Now, if that sounds like your kind of book, you may want to check out the debut novel of our guest today, Bailey Seybolt. She's the author of Coram House, a novel drawing from the real life and terrible events that occurred over decades at an orphanage in Burlington, Vermont. Bailey Seybolt joins me now in our studios to talk about the book and what inspired her to write it. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed this book. And listeners, you can join this conversation as well. Are you a lover of murder mysteries in a style reminiscent of authors like Louise Penny, Tana French, or Gillian Flynn? What do you look for in a good mystery book? Do you have questions for our guest today about why she chose to draw the plot of this novel from real-life events? If so, give us a call at 800-639-2211. That number again is 800-639-2211. You can also send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Bailey, let's start with the background for this novel. There was an orphanage that operated in Burlington for decades until the early to mid-1970s. It was called St. Joseph's. What did that place become infamous for, and why did you choose to have it to be a kind of starting point for this book?
Yeah, so I think the St. Joseph's, the actual physical building, was sort of my way into this story. When I first moved to Burlington in 2018, I lived up in the New North End, and I would pass by this sort of big looming brick building almost every day on the way back and forth to downtown. And it was quite beautiful. It was big. It had, the backdrop of Lake Champlain behind it. There was sort of this spooky graveyard next to it. And I wondered to myself, what's the story there? It looks a little derelict. It looks like it's behind a chain link fence. And so I looked up the history, and what I found was really shocking to me. Christine Keneally had just published her BuzzFeed News story on St. Joseph's Orphanage, which is a wonderful and harrowing account of what went on there that she later expanded into a really excellent book called Ghosts of the Orphanage, which didn't exist yet when I wrote this. But I think there was something about this building just sitting there sort of in the middle of town, and it felt like looking at it, you should be able to somehow tell what had happened there. But of course you couldn't. So that was the first time I had heard of it, was me sort of just Googling this building, wondering what it was.
It sounds like the building itself spoke to you like it contained something there, but you couldn't quite tell what it was.
Yeah, there was definitely an atmosphere. There was sort of a Gothic feeling of it, a feeling of it looming, a feeling of sort of spookiness. And then and other people have come up to me and said they felt the same, almost as if the building itself contained something, as if it spoke to them. And then when I looked up the history of the building, thousands of children had passed through its doors, and it operated until the 70s. And, terrible abuses had occurred there. And, it was sort of part of this history, this network of residential schools and orphanages. And the more you dig into these stories, the more you realize there's this sameness to them, of these things happening in all these different places, sometimes at the same time over the course of hundreds of years. And the silence around those experiences, this sort of enforced silence, where children came out, they might have tried to tell people their stories, nobody believed them, or people purposely tried to sort of erase these stories. I think that really spoke to me too, this feeling of who gets to decide what history is, who gets to decide whose stories are told, and that it didn't just happen here, it happened kind of all over the world.
This had to be a challenge for you, though, as an author, because you could have taken it two different ways. You could have gone for an actual true accounting of what happened there. And as you said, you mentioned Christine, the last name again, I'm sorry.
Keneally,
yeah. She eventually, did write that story, but not at the time you were writing this. What made you decide to say, I'm going to take this as the starting point, but I want to do a fictionalized version?
I mean, I think it's hard. I'm a fiction writer. So I think things that spark that part of my brain, that story part of my brain, the way I make sense of things is to write stories about them. And so I sort of, you think, what is it about this happening that has sparked something inside of me? And it was this question of who is silenced, whose stories are being told, this idea of justice, The outcome is so unsatisfying. So many of these cases get settled, they get swept away. Even if they do win in court, it's never enough for what all these children went through. And so I think there was also this thirst for some sort of retribution, for justice, and an exploration of exactly what that even means that went into this book as well.
And what happens in the book is that all these things you're talking about, that the past comes charging up to the future. It comes up to the present. And the narrator of your book, Alex Kelly, is from New York City, as you are originally, too. I think you've drawn a little bit there.
I made it easy for myself.
You made it easy, right. And, you've been here a while now, as you said, since 2018. In the book, Alex often tells us how she struggles with finding a sense of belonging in the city of Burlington, where she's come to live temporarily. She's been hired to be a ghostwriter, to write this story, like this true crime story. Did you struggle, or maybe you still do from time to time, with that sense of being from away, maybe not fitting in here?
I don't. I actually love it. I think for her, my narrator, Alex, is someone who has had both sort of a personal tragedy. She lost her husband, and she's sort of this disgraced true crime writer so she's fleeing her past a little bit. Yeah. So I think some of her sense of dislocation comes from that. She's ended up in this place where she doesn't know anyone, but some of that is by choice. She's sort of looking to avoid the more personal aspects of her life. For me, I sort of always had this dream of moving to Vermont. So I was also new when I was writing the book, but I think I loved being in a new place because you bring this sense of observation because you're experiencing everything for the first time. What is it like to stand on the frozen lake in the middle of winter? What does a Vermont cold feel like, which was different than any other kind of cold I had experienced it. And so I think a lot of that actually made its way into the book, this sense of observing, of being an observer of a new place.
We're speaking with Bailey Seybolt, whose debut novel is called Coram House. It's based on real-life events that occurred at the St. Joseph's Orphanage in Burlington, Vermont. If you'd like to give us a call and ask a question of our author, 800-639-2211 is the number to call. And you can also send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Getting back to, this sense of Alex, the narrator, trying to fit in here, being in this new place. You have a lot of fun, it seems, describing the Burlington from the perspective of an outsider. Alex is continually amazed at how big Lake Champlain really is. It just keeps stretching and stretching. I love that part. And, of course, the Vermont winter and dealing with that. Did you have a bit of a learning curve getting used to the winter series? You said it was a different kind of cold.
Yeah, you would think I would know what I was walking into because I lived in Montreal for 5 years, and Montreal is, they have dump trucks that cart out the snow after a big snowstorm with this giant vacuum that sucks them up. It is very cold there. But I think city cold is different because you're sort of scurrying from the subway to wherever your destination is. I had never lived in a place where you sort of spend as much time outside in the cold. So it took me about one winter, and then I realized that long underwear was just the key. You put it on in like November, and you take it off in March.
Winter.
Yeah,
that's exactly it. Yes.
That is it. So once I discovered that, it was great. We were good. It was golden.
There are plot twists aplenty in this book, as any good murder mystery would have. I don't think I'm giving too much away when I say that one device you do not employ is something that's become really popular, it seems, ever since the success of the book and then the movie Gone Girl. Not throwing any shade at Gillian Flynn here at all, but, she uses that unreliable narrator as, to throw the reader off the scent. You don't do that with this book. Do you feel like that trope has perhaps been overused a little bit in this genre?
I think like all tropes, if there's a really specific reason why you're choosing to do that and it makes sense for the context of your novel, then it makes sense. But I think sometimes there can be sort of a bandwagon effect where people see it done once or twice really well, and then it just sort of seems like a good idea. And I think for my book, Alex does sort of have a disgraced background in the sense that she had a book that really didn't go well, and she sort of made some assumptions, and there was real life fallout from that. But it was important to me that some part of her was sort of trying to atone for that she felt really invested in the story she was trying to tell, and she wanted to do right by the children she was writing about. So I think she's a bit messy. She drinks too much. She makes some bad decisions. She is sort of running away from her past, but I didn't want her to be unreliable in that sense, the one that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I want to get into more of what happened to Alex and the reason that she's coming to Vermont, to be this ghost writer a little bit later, because it's a really important point of the book. But, first, I mentioned this book has a real literary quality to it. You can enjoy it, of course, for the propulsive plot, trying to figure out the mystery at its core. I found the descriptions, though, of the harsh Vermont winter landscape, how it affects the characters, one of the most enjoyable things about reading it. I'd love for you to read a passage from Chapter 8. And the backdrop to this is an early morning jog that the narrator Alex is taking, and when there's seemingly no one else around. This is a prelude to a very shocking discovery that we won't give away here. But if you could just read us that section, I think it sets a really good example for the kind of atmospheric eeriness you've created.
The snow squeaks beneath my feet, loose and dry as sand. The sky is blue ombre now, but it still feels like night beneath the trees. The path passes between two lichen-covered boulders and widens into a clearing. Another trail joins along with another set of footprints. They're small, a woman's footprints. At least I'm not alone in here. The trees thicken and the snow gets crisp and hard as if I'm running on a crust of sugar. A sign nailed to a tree promises a viewpoint in half a mile. The trail tilts steeply up, and I slow to avoid breaking an ankle on the knobby, buried tree roots. By the time I crest the rise, each breath feels jagged as a shard of glass, and I'm hoping this viewpoint will be worth it. Abruptly, the trees fall away, and I'm on top of a rocky cliff. A guardrail, all that stands between me and the sweeping expanse of ice and water below. This must be the tip of Rock Point, right at the place where the ice meets the open water, a line between dark and light. A wave moves across the water, then meets the edge of the ice and tunnels beneath like a giant worm. I grab for the railing as vertigo washes over me.
I love that section so much for so many reasons, and one of them is that, and I have to ask here, that's Rock Point, the setting you put that. It sounds a lot to me like a place that I have gone for years with walks with my dog, Red Rocks. Is it?
It's funny. So when I started writing this book, I read a lot sort of in my head, where I'm taking these long walks and kind of working things out of my head. And both at Rock Point and Red Rocks, I would go and sort of walk in these loops. And I think in the end, the book, that place kind of became an amalgamation of those two places. So it's a bit of an Easter egg for local readers where they might recognize that not everything is exactly as it appears in real life in the book. But yeah, so you're right there.
I'm so glad to hear that. And you do make mention at one point, I think in the acknowledgments or beforehand, that you actually apologized to the reader for saying, I took some liberties with the geography of Burlington here. But again, it's a work of fiction. You have to create it so it fits into this world you've created.
Yeah, well, so I think when I started writing it, I didn't really know I was writing a book, and I didn't think that anyone was ever going to read it. So I felt very free to do whatever I wanted. And then by the time it was finished, I felt like almost everything is pretty true to life, but not everything. So I felt like I owed an apology to the people of Vermont for taking liberties.
Very nice of you. I don't think it was necessary. I think we were all caught up in the action. I am interested, though, in what you were just saying about that sense of freedom where you didn't really even know you were writing a book. Because it's so hard to write a book, when it's done well, you make it look easy. But how was your writing process? What was it that drove you as you continued the story? Yeah,
so it is really hard to write a book, and I had tried before and failed. So I had, a novel sitting in a drawer, which, you get used to rejection as a writer, but it's never fun. And so when I started this, I decided I was just going to do something for myself, and I wasn't going to show it to anyone. I was just going to write it for myself, and I think that was really freeing. I wouldn't even refer to it as a book. I would call it the project, like as if I was going off into a room to do this, really secret, like knitting or whatever. It could have been anything, right? And so I started doing it, and it was just for myself, and that felt totally freeing. Like I could make all these mistakes. I could do whatever I wanted because no one was ever going to see it. And so it wasn't until it was completely finished and I thought, well, maybe I should send it out and see if an agent would be interested in taking me on. So that was actually the first person who ever read the book was an agent. And then we sold it, I think it's like 6 weeks later. So it was really quite a whirlwind process.
I was going to say, that's an incredible, must have been an amazing feeling to know that first agent said, you know what, I think you got something here.
Yeah, it's like I've experienced both ends of the spectrum, the publishing spectrum, when it goes really well and when it, doesn't go so well. So
what about growing up? I imagine you've been a fiction writer. You say, you've read a lot of fiction, I'm sure. Did you always have an eclectic sort of collection of writers that you liked, or did you really kind of stick to this genre pretty much?
No, I had a very eclectic reading tastes growing up, and I still do. I love genre fiction. I love literary fiction. I think I was always not necessarily a mystery reader growing up, but I loved Gothic novels like Daphne du Maurier and the Brontes, and I loved horror too, Stephen King and Shirley Jackson. I think books that built an atmosphere that kind of could elicit that sense of unease. And then mysteries, too, that where you just really wanted to keep pushing forward to the end. But I think also my favorite books were where the literary and genre novels touched. I always loved Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin is one of my favorite books ever.
Oh, it's a great one.
And it's like a sci-fi wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a literary novel. So I do love where those things collide.
Yeah, I think it's great when you can find an author who may be associated with a particular genre, but actually inspires you to read more. Ursula K. Le Guin comes to mind,
yes,
when you talk about science fiction, but she's so literary, and she can create all these worlds, and then you end up just enjoying the actual writing of the book, as well as the science fiction plot and what have you.
Yeah, exactly. Because, when you think about it, literary is sort of just shorthand for character development, for, poetic writing. And so I think there's a lot of books out there that, it's more of a marketing label. Are they a literary novel? Are they a mystery? It sort of just depends who you ask to define them.
And, when you think about creating this plot, and you've decided, okay, I'm going to make this a murder mystery here, and I'm going to give all this backstory and talk about, a lot of the trauma that happened with these kids and what have you. Were you thinking about it in a visual sense, like, okay, if I was making a movie, I know you're writing a book, but, creating those visuals in your head as well?
Yeah, I do tend to think pretty cinematically when I'm writing. I think part of it is because setting is so important to my writing, and I think to give a sense of place and a sense that the place really affects the characters, that they're reacting to it. And I think it's also, to create that, you sort of have to have that cinematic vision in your head. And I think my favorite novels, again, are ones where the setting really sort of takes on almost a character of its own and becomes integral to the telling of the story.
That's why I think Vermonters especially will really enjoy this book, because you do get that sense of place here. And, if you're not from Vermont, I think you'll still get that sense of place. But, the little Easter eggs you were talking about, little places in and around Burlington, you had a good sense, too, of sort of like, people might not realize there's a great variety of food you can get in Burlington and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that Vermont is such a wonderful place to set a novel because I remember moving here and biking on the bike path through Burlington and seeing Lake Champlain. And I was sort of shocked in the way that Alex is, just at the expanse of it, the feeling that it's just there. And it's like every time I come around a corner and I see it set out before me, it still surprises me.
Yeah, I feel that way about the mountains too.
Yeah.
They're so close, and everywhere you go, there's like they're right there, and you get that sense of, I really am surrounded by these incredible landscapes.
There's so much natural beauty, and I think especially a novel that deals with I think, sort of a scary history, a dark piece of history, being able to contrast it with that natural beauty in a book felt really important too, and very effective.
And I want to talk a lot more about that when we come back from a break. We're going to hear more from Bailey Seybolt about her debut novel, Coram House. We'll be taking your calls as well. 800-639-2211 if you want to join the conversation, or write to us an email at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. We're back after this break. This is Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lefrak. And we're speaking today with Bailey Seybolt, the author of the book Coram House, which draws from the real-life events that took place at an orphanage called St. Joseph's in Burlington. The book delves into the consequences of long-held trauma and how the abuses of the past can affect events and people even decades after. And listeners, you can join this conversation if you'd like. If you have questions for Bailey Seybolt about her book, or about how you feel about true crime stories or fiction derived from real-life events, give us a call at 800-639-2211. That's 1-800-639-2211, or you can send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Bailey, I want to ask about things like true crime podcasts. They're very popular. My daughter, for some strange reason, really likes them, which I find incredibly disturbing. Were you, you mentioned you were tempted maybe to write about St. Joseph's as a work of nonfiction, but it had been done. I'm wondering how you feel about true crime podcasts themselves, because it's the kind of thing where it can feel a little exploitative, perhaps.
I totally agree. I think I have really mixed feelings about them. And one of the reasons I gave Alex the job of true crime writer is because I could kind of explore that, because I think she has really mixed feelings about her job as well. I think it's hard because, at their best, there's been true crime out there that has actually helped catch the bad guy, that has done a really important job at, bringing certain crimes to light, or asking, why we're focusing on some crimes over other crimes. But I think at its worst, it can feel like it's exploitation. It can feel like you're just a voyeur, sort of using people's pain as entertainment. So I do have a lot of questions and mixed feelings. And I think for me, writing this book, I spent a lot of time asking myself those questions too. What is the right thing to do here? Can you use a piece of history and turn it into fiction? Is that the wrong thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? So I think there is no easy answer to that question.
And you really worked this into the plot, too, because Alex, your narrator, her first book of true crime was a big hit. And as you say, it helped actually solve a crime. Her second one did not turn out so well. Yeah. And in fact, it had the opposite effect. Briefly describe why she's carrying this trauma of her own from what she did with her second book.
Yeah, so she was sort of a best-selling author, reluctantly sort of got pushed a little bit into taking on a certain case as her second book. And during the research for this book, she sort of, suggested that the brother of the victim might have had something to do with it. And sort of in her head, she's thinking, oh, well, I'm sort of presenting a few different ways this crime could have gone. But the reality is that the case was reopened. He was prosecuted, he went to jail, and later it turned out he hadn't done it at all. So I think, it wasn't her fault. Of course, she's not the person who sent him to jail. She wasn't the judge and the jury, but she was responsible in some way. And I think she accepts that responsibility and she feels it very deeply. And I think it also gets back to this idea of responsibility can be this really slippery thing, right? You don't always have to be the person who has held the knife, committed the crime to bear some level of responsibility. Sometimes it's just looking away from things makes you kind of complicit in some way. So I think giving her that background and having sort of been really successful and also not successful, this idea of complicity and responsibility is something that she feels sort of really deeply inside herself as well.
And it also creates this great tension for the character, because now she's almost got like this third chance. Like, what's going to happen here? Yeah. She's been hired by this mysterious guy to be a ghostwriter. He's going to put his name on the book that's about St. Joseph's or Coram House in this case.
Yep.
But, she's conflicted and she doesn't know whether to trust this guy. What's he hiding? And it turns out there are some things that he's hiding. And again, we're not going to give anything away. You really got to read the book and find out what's at the core of this mystery here. But I think, infusing the character with that kind of self-doubt makes her more interesting. She's not one of these, knows all the answers before they come up kind of thing.
And like we talked about, there's the unreliable narrator, and then there's sort of the person who's not reliable to themselves. And I think she has a lot of self-doubt and doesn't necessarily trust her instincts anymore. So there's a lot of questions of, is it the way she thinks it is? Or, should she be trusting the people who are telling her that there's no connection between these certain deaths, that she's wrong?
What about the kind of trauma that you were sort of, because you did some research here, as you were saying, I mean, what were your methods for looking into what happened at St. Joseph's?
Research is a funny thing. I find for me, a little bit can be really helpful, and too much I actually find is limiting, because you start feeling beholden to telling things the way they happened, just so the sort of happening truth and not the story truth, which is the direction you need to take the novel. So I read that initial article, and then I sort of made the decision not to look into it any further until the book was mostly done. And at that point, I did do some research. I looked more deeply into what had happened at St. Joseph's. I wanted to make sure that the abuse that, is described or referred to, it's pretty light on actual descriptions in the book, because I don't think we need to go there.
Sure.
That it's something that had happened at St. Joseph's or another residential school like it, because some of it is so extreme. It felt really important to me to be true to exactly what had happened, because it's almost like if you fictionalized what had happened to the children, I would have had to soften it, because it's almost unbelievable. So it's a little bit like, I know when Margaret Atwood was writing The Handmaid's Tale, she made the decision that everything that happened in that book had to have happened at some point in history. Wow. And so I think for this book, it was like, okay, anything that happens to these kids has to be something that's actually happened.
Well, it's fascinating. You were telling me before we went on air, actually, that you did a reading of the book, and then you had someone who had a connection to St. Joseph's come up to you afterwards. What happened there?
I did. So it was a librarian, actually, and her father and his siblings had been in St. Joseph's for a few years. Wow. And she thanked me for writing the book, actually, which was really amazing, because I'm never sure how those conversations are going to go. And I think for her, it felt really powerful that to have a story being told that feels like it shines a light on what had happened there, even if it was obviously this is fiction, but feeling like more people are sort of understanding and sort of paying attention to this piece of history felt really powerful for her to be able to talk about it.
The paying attention part is really important because, again, your narrator in the book, Alex, is trying to find out what happened to one specific boy who was at Coram House. Something terrible happened to him, but the worst part to her, it seems, was that his entire memory, his entire existence in a way, was erased. There's no records of him. She can't even find out his last name at first. And she wants him to be remembered. I mean, is that sort of really the overarching central point of this book?
Yeah, I think that so much of this book is about, whose stories get told and then who gets to decide whose stories get told. And I think if you look at the history of this, you had kids who were going into these orphanages who might be going in with siblings, and people wouldn't even tell them they were related. They wouldn't even call them by their real names. They'd call them by numbers instead. So there was so much erasure.
That happens in the book, too.
And it happens in the book because, to me, this sense of erasure, of erasing someone's history, of erasing their sense of self. I mean, there's physical abuse, which is terrible, but if you're sort of taking away someone's family, everything down to their name, there's sort of this. It just feels so terrible in a way that goes beyond just hurting someone physically.
And even some of the characters in this book who are very unlikable and do some really terrible things, some of them have suffered this abuse at Coram House, and you do feel you come through with a kind of sympathy for them. There is an empathy there from the reader for those characters, right?
Yeah, I think it gets back to this idea of responsibility being really messy, because when something like this exists in a community, a place like Coram House, it has these effects that go on for generations, this sort of generational trauma. And so to me, that felt like what the book was really about. It's not, it's pretty light on on-page violence because I don't think it really needs that. And what the book is really about is what happens afterwards and the effects that keep on happening.
Yeah, and the reader can fill in a lot of those blanks anyway. When you're talking about that, I am glad, and this can be a personal preference, but I am glad that there was not a lot of great detail about the abuses that happened there. There are some things you talk about in the book, that kids went through that, again, not in great detail, but you get this sense of like, okay, that's pretty terrible. So you're setting that scene, but you're letting the reader fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
And I think that's what most good fiction will actually do. Why do you think it is that people are drawn to murder mysteries in the first place? I mean, they can be pretty grisly.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's on one hand, there's the aspect of just the puzzle. Like a puzzle is really satisfying. Something happens, the structure, the sort of conventions of the genre. Something's going to happen at the beginning, and you're going to have an answer for the most part by the end. Who did it, what happened. So I think there is a part of that that's just very satisfying. It kind of creates disorder from the universe, like the worst thing that can happen. And then by the end, your universe is back in order, which I think is actually, as a human, is very satisfying.
For sure. And, Alex in the book often uses that word puzzle. She talks about the puzzle fitting into place. One thing moves and she feels like a clunk almost, It's right there. I have to ask this too, because, as a reader, when I'm reading a good murder mystery, of course, I'm trying to figure it out. I've got this, it's a challenge, I'm going to figure this out before the author's not going to get me. And you've got that too, right? So my question is, can you focus too much on that big plot twist as a writer? The idea that fooling the reader, is the mark of success for books like this. But can a murder mystery succeed even if the reader figures out who done it?
I think it depends on the book. And I think that's why, like we were talking about, this sort of literary mystery where you're not just in it for the solution. You're sort of there on this journey with the characters and you want to know what happens to them. And your investment in the story goes beyond just the answer to the puzzle. Then I think, it can still work, but I still personally hope that people are surprised by the ending of the book. But I think even if you sort of knew if someone spoiled it for you, I like to think that there are still so many questions and things that the book explores that you would still be worth reading anyway.
Yeah, well, there's no way we're going to spoil it for listeners right now. I'm not going to, but I will say that, I did for one hot second have an idea who I thought did it, and then I dismissed that idea. And it turns out I should have stuck with that idea. But you got me, Bailey. You fooled me, and it was a great success. And I honestly believe that I would have really enjoyed the book either way, even if I had figured out who done it. But it is something I think that readers should find out for themselves. The book is called Coram House. It's written by Bailey Seybolt. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It was really a pleasure to talk about this book.
Thank you so much.
We have to take one more quick break, and when we come back, we'll speak with State Representative Connor Casey about another work of fiction that's based on real people and events in a comedy called Founding Effers. This is Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lefrak. Ethan Allen is pretty much to Vermont what George Washington is to the United States. It's hard to think of one founding father without the other. But while a lot is known about America's first president, even if much of it is steeped in myth rather than fact, less is known or understood about the leader of the Green Mountain Boys who helped Vermont achieve its independence from New York and New Hampshire. Connor Casey decided to find out more about Ethan Allen, and in doing so, poring over Allen's journal entries and other historical documents, he came up with a play that embraces the absurd, revels in the fantastic, and brings us a very funny view of history that nevertheless pays tribute to the man whose name has become forever linked to the Green Mountain State. Representative Connor Casey, thank you so much for speaking with us from our studios in Montpelier today. Welcome to Vermont Edition.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's great to be on.
So this is a comedy about Vermont's founding father, Ethan Allen, and the notorious Benedict Arnold as well, and their kind of relationship. When did it dawn on you that there was something funny about these two?
Well, it was just before COVID. I found myself, I have a touch of the epilepsy, Mitch, so I found myself unemployed because I couldn't drive for a period there. So, I saw a book on the shelf, and it was the journals of Ethan Allen. And I had a bunch of free time, so I started pouring through it. And I realized, the fella on the page there was in many ways not like who I saw in that statue in front of the State House every day, this sort of rigid, sort of noble-looking character. And as I delved into, both the man and the mythology, I was surprised that something like this hadn't been written before. When you hear, people describing Ethan Allen as being drunk so often that a snake would bite him and die of alcohol poisoning. So, it really just got me thinking that, as we walk through the halls of the State House, we see all these images of folks. And, I look at Matthew Lyon in particular, because he's one of the first people you see when you walk in the State House. And again, very noble in the picture. But Matthew Lyon, was arrested, won his campaign from prison, and got a number of fistfights on the floor of the House of Representatives in D.C. So, I really wanted to show the ambiguity of some of these characters who, they weren't all good. They weren't all bad either. There was tremendous courage, but, there were shortcomings too. And after watching the play Hamilton, which is it's a genius work, don't get me wrong, I kind of wanted to write the anti-Hamilton.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't sound like it was too much of a stretch to turn this story into a comedy. What was the beef, though, between Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold?
Well, I think we all know the story of the sort of heavy binge drinking at the Catamount Tavern with Ethan and the Green Mountain Boys, and sort of a spontaneous decision to capture Fort Ticonderoga. Mm-hmm. Benedict Arnold was sent up because, who are these guys? They're not capable of taking down a fort. So he tried to relieve Ethan Allen of his command there, and it was sort of put together that they would attack it jointly and immediately. And you can tell in the journals and all the writing, these two guys did not like each other. You had Ethan, who was very brash and, sort of a wild man, and a more buttoned-up Benedict Arnold, who was very official and, grew up in a family where, his father was a drunk who left, him, his mother, his sister. And I thought, this could be a fascinating, exploration of the relationship between these two here. And they do, time and time again in the Revolution, they do kind of meet up with each other. And I thought drawing that contrast would be kind of interesting. I sat down, basically to write a comedy sketch. And before I knew it, I had a 90-page buddy comedy about Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. So it was sort of new for me. But I brought it to the Vermont Playwright Circle just to workshop a few scenes there. Prior to that, people said, this is unproducible. It's a Revolutionary War play. It's got over 30 characters in it. And, no theater's ever going to buy this. But Jeannie Beckwith, who's a well-established Vermont playwright, took me aside and said, you know what, don't listen to anybody else. If it's a good enough play, somebody will pick it up.
Oh, good for her. I'm glad she gave that advice.
I was still surprised when they did, Mitch.
I don't know. I think, these are two historical characters with so much richness to them. And, even if a lot of it is steeped in myth. I do have to ask you about one thing, Connor, and this is something that I heard a long time ago. I don't know if it's true, but maybe you're the guy to ask about this. Is it true that Ethan Allen refused to, or for some reason never sat down for an official portrait, so nobody really knows what he looked like?
We have no clue what Ethan Allen looks like. There are a number of portraits, but it's somebody's best guess. So I thought that, even things like that, it added to the allure of Ethan Allen. And, certainly I painted him in some dodgy positions over the course of this play. But I did develop a real fondness for him. And I thought it was a story that, like you said in the beginning, we know about Washington, we know about Adams, we know about Benedict Arnold to some extent, but not much is known about Ethan Allen. So, I think I'll probably get lambasted by historians about some of the dates and everything. But I like to think, when you're doing history, if you can capture the character of somebody, that's just as important. Yeah. And, that's what I really try to do in this.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like you succeeded. what are some of the things that you put in the play that either were drawn from historical fact or that you kind of took some liberties with that you find most fascinating about Ethan Allen?
I had a lot of fun. I had never known, I grew up in Ireland a little bit, but, Ethan Allen, after he was captured after the Battle of Quebec, spent some time on a prison ship, in County Cork. And because Ethan disliked the British like the Irish did so much, he was a bit of a hero for the Irish as well.
I was wondering about that,
yeah. That was an interesting connection. But, when he did go to prison in England, I really took some interest in him languishing for 3 years there, coming back to America and saying, all right, enough is enough. Let's talk 14th state here.
Yeah.
And really being dismissed by Washington, saying, like, hey, look, man, you put out a bounty on the governor of New York's head before this war started, Like, yeah, he's a general now, and they don't really like the idea of a Vermont state, You'll get it. It's politics, right? So, Ethan really flirted with treason as well, just like Benedict Arnold. And as much as I tried to draw the differences between the two men, there's a lot of similarities as well. They feel underappreciated in the Revolutionary War, and they feel like they need to justify it, sometimes through pretty impulsive actions that get them in trouble. So I just, I had a blast writing it, and, it was my first play, but really inspired me to keep it up,
Did anybody try to talk you out of the title, Founding Effers?
Actually, they talked me into the title, Mitch. A bit of trivia. This was originally called Lesser Men.
Oh.
And the artistic director of the Greater Boston Stage Company, he rang me up and said, look, we love the play. We want to put it on. Nobody wants to see a play about lesser men. Like, that's so depressing, right?
Fair point.
It's like, all right, so we batted around some ideas, and Founding Effers came out of it. And I said, you know what? Like, it's so crass. Like, I don't know if I like it. I don't think I do. And I surveyed 20 of my friends. What do you prefer, lesser men or Founding Effers? And 20 out of 20 said Founding Effers. So I said, you got yourself a deal to the director?
Confirmation.
And we were off to the races. Yep.
20 people say it's good. It's probably good. Were these men, as you would describe them, Effers, Arnold, and Ethan Allen to some extent?
They absolutely were at times. But, like, I work in politics, and, there's some days I've never hated a politician more than myself. We all have deficiencies. And, I really wanted to, like, people read into the meaning of plays and everything.
Sure.
I don't know how cerebral it is, but I did want to tear down some of these statues that we see, And I worry about, in this day and age, with politicians, they become celebrities, and
I can't imagine who you'd be talking about there, but please go on.
We put them on pedestals, and before you know it, everybody's like wearing a red hat like a sports team, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's dangerous. I think we should champion ideas. We should champion policies. But on a long enough timeline, a politician's always going to let you down if they start to matter more than the things that they're talking about.
That's interesting.
And that's one thing I really wanted to get across in this play.
And, I wonder, too, if because there is that mystery surrounding Ethan Allen, we don't quite know what his full story is, if that gave you a little more freedom to stretch the facts a little bit, to have some fun with this and to not necessarily be beholden to what an historian might say and wag his finger at you. No, that's not right.
I really suffered over it at first, making sure the timeline synced up. And at a certain point, you realized, well, the comedy's suffering and the story is suffering as a result of that. And, it was interesting listening to the previous guest, his history's ridden by the winners and everything. And, I wanted to delve beneath that a little bit, delve deep enough that you're feeling the molten lava and stuff. And so, it did give me some freedom, I think. But I would contest that almost every scene of it is grounded in reality and something that actually happened, with the exception of the very last scene, where I have Ethan Allen on his way to Canada to negotiate with the British, and he's met in the woods by Benedict Arnold. and it's sort of a dramatic final meeting between the two of them, talking about their motivations, and ultimately Benedict spares Ethan's life in that, and he retreats to his desolate cavern in Vermont, as I say in the play there.
So it also avoids sort of a Hamilton ending, because we know it didn't turn out well for him.
It did not.
His rival.
He was neither loved by the crown nor the Americans at the end. But he did say, at the end, when I die, let me be buried in my old uniform, and may God forgive me for ever wearing another one. So even like the most, you think of him as such a villain, but Benedict Arnold did great things to advance the cause of this country, right? And there's good and bad in everybody who walks the earth, I think.
No question about that. And yes, you're talking about some very complex figures here, and certainly Benedict Arnold at one time was considered a great American patriot, despite how things turned out there in the end. In the end, how do you think Ethan Allen is going to be remembered if people went and saw this play, Founding Efforts?
I think you would see him as a courageous individual who deeply cared about Vermont. He cared about Vermont more than he cared about the cause of the Continental Army there. And I hope it shows him as, a loyal person, even though he's deeply flawed, impulsive, and did make some mistakes that he suffered for and those around him suffered for. But I hope it does take the story of our founder, beyond the borders of Vermont. So I was really grateful when this was picked up in Boston.
How do you think Ethan Allen would feel about it if he saw the play?
You know what? I think he might like it. It seemed like he had a good sense of humor at the end of the day. And, I think he'd be happy that people were still talking about him and how much he loved Vermont and how much he was responsible ultimately for Vermont gaining statehood, even though it was after he passed.
Yeah, 14th state, it is because pretty much of the efforts of Ethan Allen, for sure. It's really fun to talk to you about this, Connor, and I hope that you were able to, maybe make yourself feel a little bit better about politics in the end. Did it feel like it was a bit of a cathartic, endeavor here to do this?
It is, yeah. It's definitely blending the worlds. Serving in the State House, you do meet quite eccentric characters on a daily basis there. And some of us take ourselves very seriously. We represent like 4,000 people, but our heads are so big we can barely fit through the doorway, right? So I think it's important to have levity and, realize that, we're just people like anybody else. And again, you shouldn't celebrate any politicians. It's you'll only get hurt in the end.
It doesn't hurt to laugh, does it? The play is called Founding Efforts, and it's written by Connor Casey. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mitch.
And that's it for today. As always, you can weigh in on our show or pitch us ideas by emailing Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. And you can also find Vermont Public on Instagram. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Our call screener today was Rick Barrett, and our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. And today, by the way, we bid farewell to our spring semester intern, Anna Berg. Anna has done a fantastic job becoming a part of our team, and we wish them all the best in the future. Thank you so much, Anna, for all your hard work. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. I want to thank you so much for listening. Michaela Lefrak will be back later on, and we'll catch up again soon. Thanks for tuning in to Vermont Edition today.